So a funny thing happened on the way to being here today, and that was realizing that as the director of Digital Pedagogy Lab, it's my job to introduce people, to sort of honor them and mispronounce their names, and welcome them to the stage. And realizing I was going to have to do that today for one of my best friends was a little bit interesting. Recognizing I've never introduced Jesse. So this is a really interesting experience for me. How do you introduce one of your best friends, your longest lived professional colleague and collaborator? And frankly, you do so adoringly. The first time I saw Jesse teach was when I realized I'm going to get choked up, and so I'm sorry. First time I saw Jesse teach was when I realized that teaching could be an art. Like watching one of those nature shows where a bear is scratching its back against the tree, or a wolf is trotting through the woods with a puppy-like grin on its face. To watch Jesse teach is to watch someone in his most natural habitat. Pedagogy isn't a theory to him, it's an instinct, coming as naturally and with as much ease as chalk to chalkboard. In the 16 years that we've worked together, Jesse has continued to inspire and challenge me. Emphasis on the challenge me. When he founded Hybrid Pedagogy in 2011, I had long ago left academia for very different fields, and I resisted his ask that I return to help with the journal. He did not insist I return because he wanted to keep working with me, though that was a factor. He insisted because he believed I had a voice that should be heard, when no one else in academia believed the same. Working together since then on both Hybrid Pedagogy and Digital Pedagogy Lab, we have both worked tirelessly. Well, actually, we've been exhausted most of the time, to make a space for other voices, and to do what we can to amplify those voices across the internet, in our writing, and at events like these. Creating spaces for others is at the core of what Jesse does, what he does ceaselessly. His LinkedIn information doesn't come close to doing him justice. Yes, he's the executive director for the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies at the University of Mary Washington. And yes, he's also the executive director of the nonprofit that we founded together, Hybrid Pedagogy, Inc. He has a dizzying number of publications to his name. He's presented all over the world on topics from digital humanities to zombies, social justice to critical digital pedagogy. But the reason behind these CV vitals is that he continually puts himself in places where people need help. Everything Jesse does professionally is focused on, bent on, come hell or high water, lifting other people up. That's what his teaching is about. That's what his writing is about. That's what Hybrid Pedagogy and Digital Pedagogy Lab are about. So please welcome my friend, my longtime collaborator, who works too much, teaches far too seldom, and who is the beating heart of this event, Jesse Stommel.
Hello. Hello. Oh, I think I did something. Oh, there we go. Hello. How's that in the back there? Hello? You getting that? Okay. Is that too loud for anyone? Okay. Because I get excited. And I intend to get excited. The thing that I'm going to start by talking a little bit about is the journey that I've had giving keynotes in front of audiences like this. And I thought about this, and I was having a conversation with Rasul about this a couple days ago. And she and I came from a very similar place. We are classroom teachers. We are people who work with individuals. We are people who bring out the best in the people that are in the room with us. That's what we do. That's what we thrive on. That's what we enjoy. That's what we love. So keynote, while teaching is my natural habitat, giving a keynote is not my natural habitat. And in fact, I even encourage Sean to try and bring some more people to the front of the room because I literally can't do this without people on the other end. I think some of you have probably given webinars. I've been asked to give webinars. I now, like, if the word webinar is used and someone is asking me to do it, I start to shake. I literally start to panic because so often I've given webinars and there are no actual people on the other end. And so often, if they can't give me the people, I'll say, can you at least put yourself on a screen so I can talk to you? Because it's so difficult for me to imagine doing this work without other people there. So behind me is the most important person in my life right now. That's not me when I was a child. That's my 7.5-month-old daughter, Hazel. She's here with me in this event, at this event, and it's not actually. But she's here with me at this event. Everyone's like, bring her, where is she? My students always want me to bring her to class, and I have several times, and it's just absolute joy. Because something happens when you bring yourself to an event like this. Something happens when you bring your life to an event like this. Something happens when you bring yourself to a keynote. One of the things I do when I give a keynote is I always want to talk about something that makes me uncomfortable. Something that I hadn't planned to talk about, tell a story, and not a story I've told before, because what it does is it sits me in the room with all of you. I'm even going to start sitting and tell this story. So before I tell that story, I'll tell you a little bit about what my keynote is going to be. It isn't the keynote that was advertised on the program. It is a completely different keynote. I'm co-teaching the writing track with Sean, who in some ways is one of my writing mentors. And I had flirted with the idea of maybe writing my keynote in the track over the course of 2.5 days. I thought that'd be neat. That'd be a nice thing to do. I could try that. It was also a little scary, so I kind of planned a keynote that was something else and thought, if I write something in the moment, I'll deliver it. So it turns out that wasn't possible for me anymore. A few days ago, Donald Trump's transgender ban made me realize that the keynote that I was going to give would not only be inappropriate, but would be disrespectful to the space. And so I've completely changed the topic, and I'm going to pop up the title of my piece today. My piece today is going to be about queering open pedagogy. And and in some ways, what you're about to see me talk about is not the work. It's sort of the work that I've been living for the last 17 years in the classroom, but it isn't necessarily the work that I've been writing about nearly as much. It is, in a way, Sean and I are currently. I'm going to give you a little bit of vaporware. This is the first time that we're telling anything about this, so who knows how long it's going to take you to actually receive this thing or get to read this thing. Sean and I are working on a book together, and it's a compilation of our duets that we've done over the years. Some of my writing, some of his writing, and some of our writing merged together. One of the reasons why I wanted to publish this book, and it'll be published open access for free, as well as you'll be able to pay for a print version if you want. One of the reasons I wanted to publish it is because I wanted to put a part of my career to rest so that I could move on to something else. In some ways, all of the stuff that's in that work will be alive in the next phase of my career. But this is the next phase of my career. What's behind me? And in some ways, I'm going to be working that out with all of you in the moment. And I've been working it out over the last 2.5 days as I've tried to write this thing that will be the first of this part of my work and my journey as a teacher. So, a story. Today, I'm live tweeting my wedding to Joshua Lee because some things need to be public. He and I have been married. Actually, you know what's crazy? I'm going to go look at the date because I always get our anniversary wrong. I'm going to remind myself so I don't get it wrong in front of a whole room full of people. And then he'll watch it and he'll be like, oh gosh, not again. The weird part is it's easy for me to remember the date, but it's very difficult for me to remember the year. Which, you should be able to say, yeah, we've been married 3 years. So it's been 3 years, which I just confirmed. We were married on June 13th. And June 13th, it was Friday the 13th, which is interesting. And I often joke with him that means I can take it all back. at any point. I won't take it back. So no one came to our wedding. And the reason no one came to our wedding is we didn't decide to get married until 9 p.m. the night before. Wisconsin, both Josh and I had had a troubled relationship to the notion of marriage. Both come from divorced families, several divorces. And for us, marriage felt like a bureaucratic gesture. I've since changed my view on that quite a bit. And in fact, the experience of getting married helped me change that feeling quite a bit. So a few months before we got married, I came home one day and I said to Josh, I said, get in the car, we have to go fill out some paperwork. And he said, oh, okay. Gets in the car, we drive to the city office in Madison, Wisconsin, and we're filling out this paperwork. And the person who we're filling it out with congratulates us. And I'm like, oh well, thank you. The paperwork we were filling out was a domestic partnership agreement. And I had literally said to Josh, as though it was an errand that we have to run, come, fill out this paperwork. And I was doing it because I wanted him to get health insurance. Like for me, it was purely, it wasn't bureaucratic, it was practical. His life, I felt like his life was on the line. And so we got out of the office, and I'm sitting in the car, we're about to drive home, and I look over at him, and he's got the biggest grin on his face. And I'm like, what are you, like, and then it hit me, and I realized what had just happened. And it meant something, it was important to me, and I shared it with people on Facebook, and the responses that people had were some of the most generous, most welcoming things that I'd experienced in my life. And I realized that it had nothing to do with the paperwork, that I was saying something to Josh that day, and he was saying something to me, and that was important for us to be able to say that. So a few months later, it's Friday. No, it's actually Thursday. So it's Thursday. We're at the gym. I get done working out a little bit before he does. Maybe I was a little lazy that day. Actually, no, he takes a really long time to shower, like 30 minutes he'll spend in the shower. Like, don't, I was just about to say it, and now I guess I'm going to say it. I don't know what he's doing in there. So I like that delay laugh. Thanks for that, Tara. Okay, so here I am sitting there waiting for him to come out of the, and I realize as I'm telling this story that I'm gonna have to skip about 20 of my slides, but that's totally fine. I'm with you here in this moment. I'm sitting there, and I pick up the newspaper, and I find out that the marriage had been legalized. I knew this. Marriage had been legalized in the state of Wisconsin. And I picked up the newspaper, and I read that there was going to be the judge was going to be staying the ruling the next day at noon. And so it was going to be no longer legal. So marriage was legal for exactly 1 week in the state of Wisconsin. And this was about 9 months, I think, before it became the law of the land. And I read that, and it really struck me. And I got home, and I said to Josh, 9 p.m., we had dinner. After dinner, I said, what are you doing tomorrow morning? And he said, I don't know. What do you want to do? And I said, let's go get married. And so we decided to go get married, and then there we were the next morning. He made me wear a tie, which was interesting. I just wanted to go in my pajamas, because I'm like, we're just going to the courthouse to get married. Because again, for me, it was turning in paperwork, and I didn't really realize what it meant. And so my husband has to remind me that these things actually mean something. For me, it felt like a gesture, not just a gesture to him, but a gesture to many, many more people, to my students, to fellow teachers, to anyone that would listen. So I said to Josh, I said, can I live tweet our wedding? And he's very private. And I had, up to that point, not really made huge revulsions online. I'm very personable on Twitter, but I'm not usually super personal on Twitter, if that distinction makes sense. So he said yes. And I said, okay, I'm going to live tweet our wedding. So I'm going to let you see the tweets. Whoops, that's not the tweets. Will be the tweets. The internet works. It does. It's an old thing called a Twitter timeline. They kind of took these away, but you can actually find the entire thing. So here we are. Today I'm live tweeting my wedding to Joshua Lee, because some things need to be public. Josh and I decided to do something today. There we are deciding. Mary the dog is our flower girl. Mary is no longer with us, but this was in the last year of her life, and it meant a lot for me to take that walk down with her downstairs with us in our ties and have her get to be our little flower girl. Something should be public. 2 boys getting married today. So this tweet right here is when Sean saw this tweet. He said, wait, what? And maybe I should let him speak this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try and channel him. Wait, what? So I get a phone call. By that point, we are already in the county clerk's office filling out the paperwork. So I put him on Skype. I put him on video. He sat with us in the county clerk's office and filled the paperwork out with us. I had someone at our wedding. At that moment, it struck me how much this meant, that it wasn't just about Josh and I, that it was also something about my relationship to everyone else in my life. There we are. This is what people look like in the waiting office. Marriage license down on our way to the courthouse. We literally had to walk from the county clerk's to the courthouse. Let's look at what the time on this tweet is. Will it tell us? It is 8:13 a.m. The ruling was going to be stayed. I think the ruling was actually going to be stayed at 1 p.m. We ended up finally getting married at 12 noon, so an hour before the stay. The wedding party at the courthouse. So the judge, who's a wonderful, wonderful woman, there had to be a certain number of witnesses. She went up and down the halls of the courthouse. We had none with us. I don't think Twitter was going to count as a witness, but probably many, many more people were on Twitter witnessing this. She found people randomly in the halls and brought them in. And then here. And this one still hits me a lot. And this one I think is the crux of why I wanted to tell this story. And the happy deed is done. 8 years together so far, and this is actually our first public kiss. Josh and I had our first public kiss, which was live tweeted. And with Josh's permission, not a surprise. So I'll tell you that Josh and I have had 2 public kisses, ever. They were both at our wedding. We've been together 12 years. For me, it isn't that I worry what people will think. It's that I worry about being physically harmed. And this public kiss somehow meant a lot, and it has made me feel safer, but I still don't feel safe. The 2017 Open Ed Conference recently announced a keynote from the Global Education Initiative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A few clicks away from information about the Global Education Initiative on LDS.org are words, which I will not quote, that suggest LGBTQ people are subhuman, and that while they encourage compassion, the church's doctrine, this part I will quote, will not change. That really struck me. Will not change, period. The section that this is in had talked about the change in the church and how the church had come to this place of compassion. But the finality of this, will not change, really hit me. The community response to the Open Ed announcement was swift, and the keynote was changed. But the conversation that arose in the wake of the announcement continues. And I think what's important for me, I actually didn't jump into the conversation until after the keynote had been changed. And part of the reason was because what struck me was that it was not even close to nearly enough, not even the tiniest move towards enough. One tweet announcing that the keynote would change, as though you can just say that feeling that I have, that means that my husband, who I've been with for over 11 years, don't feel comfortable holding hands in public. With our daughter, we're trying to teach ourselves to hold hands in public because I want our daughter to see that. We're not good at it. We still pull away the first time someone sees us. Here's some of the reactions and this is someone in the room, in fact, both of the people here that I'm quoting are in the room, because the reactions are also what inspired me to speak out. This is from Tara, who is in the room with us. I don't want to be politely tolerated and kept out. Let's celebrate and harness our diversity to truly open education. I don't want to be politely tolerated. That word tolerated feels really, really important there. I'm not tolerated when I go to an academic conference that should be welcoming me, one that has open in the title. And kept out really struck me as well, because tolerated, you would think, would welcome people in, and I think it does just the opposite. For me, that tweet that said the keynote would change made me less likely to ever go to Open Ed again. It made me feel tolerated. And for me, that's the worst possible feeling. This is from Karen, who's also in the room with us. And she did a long thread, a really inspiring thread. You can see that this is the 9th out of 9 tweets. Every single one of these tweets is wonderful. And really sets, in 9 tweets, to be able to say not only how this feels, but what the intellectual problems are that underlie the getting to that point and the getting to that conversation. But this is the piece that I think is important. We cannot be silent about this. I love that cannot is in all caps. And I love this about this, because it isn't just Open Ed. It isn't just one keynote. It isn't just the open education community. It's all of these things. There's something underlying all of these things that has to be talked about. This was my tweet. This was my first tweet in reaction. How has the open community shown itself open to gay and trans educators, students, technologists? This is work that needs doing. I put open in quotes very specifically because there has been a lot of debate about what this word open means. My being hold hands with my husband is not a debate. It's not, I'm not willing to have it be a debate. There are parts of what open means that are not up for debate. Academia can be hostile to gay, queer, and trans people, and I'm continually unsettled by how infrequently this gets acknowledged. Talking about this feels the most important thing. Sadly, far too many academic projects, events, and publications driven by LGBTQ people or issues are marginalized as niche or too political. The work that Sean and I have done, both in and around this issue, has been called, it was called in a recent article, partisan. And that word, I've been grappling with that word for the longest time. What does it mean for our work to be partisan? I think that the article meant it in good faith. The article did not mean we subscribe to a particular political party. I don't think that that's what this work is about, or we subscribe to a particular religious view or set of religious views, or even we subscribe to a particular theory or way of looking at the world. But I ended up reclaiming this word partisan because I felt a little nervous about it at first. I thought, gosh, the administrators of my institution are going to see that my academic work, my professional work is partisan. And that made me nervous, that word. And then I've reclaimed it since then because to me it means that I have conviction and that those convictions are worn in everything that I do. So as I talk about queering open pedagogy and I talk about my own pedagogy, these are things that my pedagogy has worn all along. I'm not coming to some new pedagogy. What I'm coming to is a different way of talking openly about where that pedagogy comes from for me. What I see as most essential is a willingness to be human with humans, talk things out, and learn every second. In some ways, this tweet was meant to let people with differing views off the hook, to say, yes, I'm willing to sit at a table with you. I'm not willing to debate things that are not up for debate. I feel pretty strongly about that. There have been moments where I say, there's just a few topics that I will not debate. And partly I will not debate them because my view will never change. And I feel like if my view will never change, it's not fair. It's not kind. It's not generous to debate with someone. But that's only about 3 topics. To some degree, I think sitting down with people, though, has to be mutual. You have to feel both like you're going to learn from them and they're going to learn from you. I don't think we can show up at a space like the Open Ed conference, though, and learn openly from people that are hostile to us if that platform has not made space for us from the start. And that's the problem. It has to make space for us from the start. And so how do we do that? I think to some degree, we do that in this room. We figure out how that happens in this room together. I'm also unwilling to quote from Donald Trump's recent and vile tweets proclaiming a ban on transgender soldiers in the US military. We shouldn't help his bigotry by amplifying it. Retweeting abuse is abuse. Headlines quoting abuse are abuse. We need to talk about this, but must be careful not to do more harm as we do. So to some degree, I want to talk about the transgender ban, but I'm not going to repeat the words that Trump has used, vile words. Trump's tweets have been called a distraction, and yet a recent Nation article points out why it can be deeply problematic to call his tweets about the transgender ban a distraction. Richard Kim writes in that Nation article, being at once anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and anti-LGBTQ is not a diversion from some secret Trump Republican agenda. Neither is pitting us against each other. It's what they do, it's who they are. I think acknowledging that helps us find a way forward, helps us realize that we don't need to see and debate the morning news every day. Sure, we can talk about it, say that it happened, but it is not, I've been watching CNN because I watch bad TV as a way to work, and lately CNN has been interesting enough and also disinteresting enough because it's a lot of repetition. They repeat the same story over and over again. But in doing that, so I put it on in the background while I'm working. In doing that, I've heard that they're going around in circles endlessly, endlessly, endlessly. And I think as an open community, we don't need to go around endlessly, endlessly, endlessly trying to debate whether basic human rights should be respected by our organizations. On the other hand, yes, let's continue to debate open. Let's continue to debate what it means for each of us individually. But I think as a community, we can say open means LGBTQ people are accepted, are welcomed, are given space. For many LGBTQ folks, the fear of being shot, beaten up, screamed at is a constant nagging dread. Just being ourselves puts us at risk. I've been talking in my track about bell hooks, and we've been talking about what it means to be self-actualized, what it means to be vulnerable in the classroom, what it means to bring our full selves to the classroom. These are all things I think are important, and all things that bell hooks' words on these topics inspire me. On the other hand, I also think we have to acknowledge that sometimes bringing your full self to the classroom, being embodied in the classroom, being embodied in this keynote, for some people that means putting our physical bodies at risk. It means putting our lives at risk. That we cannot imagine an academia that lives outside of, or an education system that lives outside of that basic fundamental risk. When I go to Open Ed, when I go to a conference that is filled with surveillance, corporations trying to sell me things that are going to watch my students for me, little cameras that they're going to sit on the top of their computers, that isn't a distraction. That is ed tech at this moment, putting us and our students at physical risk. On June 12th at the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando, Florida, 49 people were killed and 58 wounded. It was the deadliest mass shooting in US history. Shortly after, a piece was published in the Washington Post called How to Talk to a Queer Person Who is Afraid of Dying. Carlos Maza writes, if you have queer people you care about in your life, talk to them. Always, but especially now. Maybe they seem fine. Ask them how they're doing. Tell them you love them. Tell them your love doesn't come with caveats. Tell them it's okay to cry. Tell them they don't deserve to be scared. Tell them that it's okay to be scared anyway. Tell them it's okay to be afraid of dying. Tell them that they matter to you and that you want them there. alive now. None of that will stop an LGBTQ person from being afraid of dying. I think this is important. We don't get let off the hook. We don't talk to our students. We don't talk to each other. We don't listen to this keynote. We don't come to this event and go home and we've done the work and it's over every day, every second, every minute. There isn't a second that goes by when I'm standing next to my husband and our newborn baby where I'm not worried that we might be harmed. So this is some data from, it's weird actually, I put this in there and I actually knew that there was something weird about putting this slide in here. And I thought about taking it out, and I'm just going to talk through this a little bit. I thought about taking this slide out. I'm interested in this data, it's curious data, but at this moment, data isn't going to help us. This data doesn't tell us anything. This tells me something. Looking at all of you tells me something. My students, talking to my students tells me something. This data is bullshit. In fact, most data is bullshit. At this point, when you're in this moment, if you're afraid of dying, data is not going to help you. So I'm not even going to talk about this stupid data. You can go find it for yourself. In February, I am going to have a drink of water. Because now I have to talk about Trump again. Woo! I almost thought about taking this slide out. And Sean and I talked through this slide a little bit. Because I thought, well, gosh, do we really have to say more? Hasn't this point been made? It sucks. But I think the continual drumming of this beat is what's scariest about it, is what makes it exactly not a distraction. And gosh, this is only a distraction if you're not the transgender person who is afraid of being stabbed, beaten up, and shot on the street as they walk to school. In February, the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos rescinded President Obama's 2016 Dear Colleague letter. And if you want to Google this letter, it's a really, really great, it's really interesting to read. To actually read the full letter, every word of the letter, and see what it is that the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos rescinded. The letter recommended specific protections for transgender students in U.S. public schools. The letter specifically outlined the responsibility schools have to provide a safe and non-discriminatory environment for all students, including transgender students. This shouldn't be controversial. It is. And we have to figure out, as a people, why something like this would be even the least bit controversial. Why something like this would be up for debate. Increasingly, I think the work of education is activism, not teaching. I feel like my work has changed. I feel like, in some ways, inhabiting what it is, who it is to be a teacher, must be inhabiting who it is and what it is to be an activist. I don't think we can actually do the work of education without also being activists. My queer lit course was once singled out by a national conservative group as a dishonorable mention. They had a dirty dozen. 12 of America's most bizarre and politically correct college courses. A dirty dozen. I wasn't in the top 12. Oh, I was a dishonorable mention. I know. One of those lists that I really wished I could have been on. Even the words in this are fascinating to me. The name of this thing, they actually still have this thing. You can go look in different years. You can see what this year's most bizarre and politically correct college courses are. Great titles. Like I want to be in all of those. But just the words, bizarre and politically correct. Honestly, there's nothing politically correct about my queer lit course. Bizarre. We had a whole conversation with my students because I brought the article in and my students all talked about it. We all rallied around this word bizarre. We thought, what a great word. We did some etymological work on the word bizarre. We ended up feeling like, wow, they're right. Our course is fucking bizarre. And I changed the domain name for the course to bizarrelit.com. And the students now rally around their Bizarre Lit course. And sadly, Bizarre Lit, I let the domain name lapse. And partly now that I'm talking about it, I'm like kind of sad that I did. Bizarrelit.com is a really nice domain name. There's nothing politically correct about Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was one of the folks that I was teaching in that course, one of the authors that I was teaching in that course. I'm just going to read a little bit of Gertrude Stein, in part because I think that there's something, I don't want to be too abstract when I talk about what a queer pedagogy would be. For me, a queer pedagogy is embodied. It's inspired by the kind of way that Gertrude Stein thinks about language. The way she thinks about language is the way that I increasingly am trying to think about my own pedagogy, as something embodied, something that's always evading my grasp, something that you start to read at one pace and then you speed up and you slow down, you get stuck on words. It looks a little like my classroom. A sound. A whole sound is not separation. A whole sound is an order. Suppose there is a pigeon. Suppose there is. A little shout out to Audrey Waters there. Looseness. Why is there a shadow in a kitchen? There's a shadow in a kitchen because every little thing is bigger. The time when there are 4 choices, and there are 4 choices in a difference, the time when there are 4 choices, there is a kind, and there is a kind. There is a kind. There is a kind. Supposing there's a bone, there is a bone. Supposing there are bones, there are bones. When there are bones, there is no supposing there are bones. There are bones, and there is that consuming. The kindly way to feel separating is to have a space between. This is a likeness. I thought about just putting that up and saying, there's my keynote. We can all just talk about Gertrude Stein for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to show you a short video. A video from the course. These are the students in my class. This course, this particular video was made with a group of students in a queer rhetorics course. This was 2009. It was my, or 2010 actually, 2010. It's my last semester teaching at CU Boulder. And this is one of, I always say, this is one of my favorite groups of students. They're all my favorite. I'm one of those people who has a favorite song and then I have another favorite song and another favorite song, and every song is my favorite by the end. But in this moment, this is one of my favorite groups of students. And what I did was, I don't grade. I could do a whole other keynote someday about not grading. And in fact, I feel like that's connected to my queer pedagogy. I don't grade. What I do is I have students self-assessing, and I often have them doing that in conversation with me, and conversation with each other. For this class, the assessment was this video. Throughout the course, I just passed out cameras, and they were really cheap cameras, and I also encouraged them just to use their cell phones, passed out cameras, just to film stuff. And they said, well, what are we supposed to film? And I said, well, it's a queer rhetorics course, film kind of whatever. And we were reading Gertrude Stein, we were reading Walt Whitman, we were reading Virginia Woolf, we were reading some contemporary queer theorists. And what they did is they filmed, gosh, they must have filmed 20 hours of footage or something like that. My grading of the students, grading in quotes, was I edited this video. I took all the random footage, I shot none of this, took all the random footage and I cobbled it together and then gave it back to them as a gift. They were showing off their final projects. I surprised them and said, this is my final project that I've been working on all course. So I'm gonna play this short video. Maybe. I've got a spinning wheel of death. It's a rainbow spinning wheel of death. Feel encouraged by that. Oh. There's a more rainbow spinning wheel of death. It's the rainbow spinning wheel of life. Let me correct that. I think my computer just shut down. I'm gonna plug it in, make sure that wasn't the problem. I don't think that's the problem. And then I'll turn it back on and we will have a video. Okay. Do I have a lot of power? Oh, I've got a lot of power. Okay. I'm gonna just shut my Keynote down. And open it up. Like Sean with the remotes yesterday, I did test this.
Go to your class on cinema verite.
I am excited. Do you know what we're going to be talking about?
No.
We're going to be talking about gay marriage.
Ooh.
We're going to be talking about an article that is by a queer theorist who's anti-gay marriage.
Cool.
He is anti-gay. Yeah, of course.
There's a real famous book called The Trouble with Normal. He doesn't think he thinks that marriage is a normalizing.
It is a normalizing institution. Why even buy into the hype? Actually, that makes perfect sense to me. But on the other hand, everyone strives to be normalized on some level.
He asks the question in the first paragraph, which is nice. He says, is it normal to want to be normal?
Personal about everyone in the class. Okay. And I'd say that's kind of clear about classes. Usually you go in, you sit down, you take notes, you don't really get to know anybody.
I feel like I really got to know the people in the class more than I would if I was in the other class.
I feel like there's so much openness and community that was built within this course that I grew not only as a writer and as someone who's working a lot within my practice at all times, but also as a person, getting to build a lot of community. And I really like that.
Sometimes I'm glad I didn't mess it up and I start talking.
Like I killed the giants, but so said no, you better let me use my lightning like scissors, like I cut the legs off the whales, dinosaurs and the lizards, and then grab up some bullets, we let out a laugh, so split them right down the middle, gonna cut them right up in half, in the storm clouds, gathered above, into great balls of fire.
I think the most interesting question to start with is sex normal.
Is normal defined by what we all think of it, or is it defined by culture or society? Are we talking of the culture as in America? Are we talking the culture at CU?
I think it might be getting at the root of what queer means because the most cogent definition of queer that I ever heard was against normal. Like, if this is normal, then queer is over here against it. It's against the idea of normality that everything is normal.
It made me really uncomfortable at first. When we didn't define queer for the first 3 weeks of class, I was so uncomfortable, I didn't want to say anything. But then I started to realize that it didn't really matter if we had a set definition.
Couldn't write down, I learned this vocabulary or this, terminology, things like that. But as far as the way I approach things, I think it definitely changed that.
And because of some of the things that I've learned in this class, I think about, well, okay, I could just write a paper, like that's what the professor's gonna expect, but could I perhaps do something different? Could I perhaps queer it in some way or make it something that is a little bit more me, a little bit more unique?
Trying to approach the subject of writing from a queer perspective has helped me figure out how to be a writing teacher. So in a way, I think working with you, I'm starting like at the beginning of the semester, I was like teaching writing because it was my job, and now I'm starting to realize that I can teach writing because I really love it.
Could not recognize 'cause you had blood on your face. I had blood in my eyes, but I could swear by your expression that the pain down in your soul was the same. Down in mine, that's the pain that cuts a straight line down through the heart. We call it love. We wrapped our arms around each other, but I shove ourselves back together. Making love. There was a cold dark evening such a long time ago, by the mighty hand of Joe. There was a sad story how we became lonely two-legged creatures. The story, the origin of love. That's the origin of love. The origin of love.
Got some more student voices later. It's hard to follow that. And gosh, even 8 years after teaching that class, I still feel like I know those people. I still feel like they're my friends, and some of them are my friends. Well, they're all my friends, but some of them I continue to interact with as friends. In the introduction to Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks writes, any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That was a class that really embodied that for me. Every single person in that class, I felt like came as their full, complicated selves, and it was rough for some of them to find their way into this topic. My friend Chris Friend writes in a piece called Finding My Voice as a Minority Teacher, which is published on Hybrid Pedagogy. It's a wonderful, wonderful story if you haven't read it. One of my favorite pieces that we've published on Hybrid Pedagogy, and in some ways, this piece captures his voice and who he is so, gosh, I want to say perfectly, but you know, it's raw. As a high school teacher, I kept quiet about my sexuality because I didn't want to draw attention to it. Instead, I created a deafening silence, a vacuum that tugged on everything around it and demanded attention by its absence, folding in upon himself. And I've been surprised to realize after getting married and suddenly having some weird version of heterosexual privilege that comes with like wedding presents and then having a baby and having showers. I've gotten a glimpse into heterosexual privilege that I had never had before. It's great, you get lots of gifts. Gosh, straight people give so many gifts to each other. It's wonderful. I'm happy to accept gifts after this, now that I have that heterosexual privilege. Keynote gifts. Well, in fact, straight people get the gift of being given a shitload more keynotes. Critical pedagogy asks us to rethink our approach to the classroom in fundamental ways. But it can also start in smaller gestures, the choices we make when assembling a reading list, the language we use in our syllabi when we present it, our first words in a classroom. Sometimes when I talk like this, when I give a keynote, I think the ideas are so big, but always for me the ideas are incredibly small. What choice do I make? What single choice do I make? What is the phrasing of the tweet when I cancel the keynote that makes people feel unsafe at my event? What are the specific words that I use? What do I do when I first enter a classroom? Where do I sit? Who do I talk to first? What are the first words out of my mouth? When I give a keynote, I'm actually looking at that bottle of water there and thinking, that looks very performative, like this magical bottle of water. And I'm actually going to move it and think, I looked over there and thought, that chair was very intimate, and now it's a holster for my water bottle. Like just sitting down with all of you was important for me, just being at eye level. And that, in some ways, maybe that was for you, maybe it was performative, but it was also just for me. So sometimes those gestures are pedagogical, both looking out, but also looking in, so that we can be our full selves, or as close to our full. And what does it mean to be your full self in the classroom? Like, I'm not telling you everything. I changed my story that I told you at the beginning because the first one I had felt too scary. So I thought, oh gosh, I can't do that one. And so I stepped back and I told a slightly different story, which was also scary in its own way. So it's not that bringing your full self is putting it all out there. It's deciding for yourself, what do I want to bring? Daniel Paradis writes, in The Pleasures, the Perils, and the Pursuit of Pedagogical Intimacy, I'm speaking at the very edge of what I'm trying to say. Learning is uncomfortable, and the trouble with letting someone teach you is that it leaves a mark, an impression. I think that this is true not only for our students, but it's also true for every single one of us. The second that learning stops leaving a mark, stops having an impression, stops feeling like friction, stops feeling uncomfortable, that's not learning. It's something else. I mean, it's not necessarily bad, but it isn't what I would describe as learning, or what Danny would describe as learning, or what Bell Hooks would describe as learning, or what my friend Sean Michael Morris would describe as learning. This is not how learning feels for me. In 2014, I co-authored an abstract for that year's Open Ed conference with Danielle. The title of our proposal was Queering Open. And in it, we write, our work responds to the frustrated conversation about the meaning of open by altogether challenging the impulse to neatly contain open. Daniel and I continue, to queer open is to imagine it as an emergent space, always in process. And from this vantage, open education is not confined by courses, platforms, syllabi, hierarchies, but exactly resists those containers, imagining a space for marginalized representation, a space that troubles distinctions between student-teacher and formal-informal learning, a space that recognizes our unique embodied contexts and offers opportunities for liberation from them. This was 2014. Our proposal was rejected. I've never seen myself in the program for the Open Ed conference. I've never seen myself, until this year actually, and some people in this room are, some of them will likely still be speaking on that paper, session, speaking in that session. In 2014, I hadn't. I did go in 2014, and I presented with Sean a very different presentation called If Frere Made a MOOC. But this presentation, Queering Open, in some ways was me figuring out what my work was going to do next. It's taken me 3 years to start that work. It could have started then. It does not seem possible to think of oneself as normal without thinking that some other kind of person is pathological. I'm just going to leave that one. I'm going to let us sit with that for a second. I'm going to repeat it. And I misspelled his name. It's Michael Warner. It does not seem possible to think of oneself as normal without thinking that some other kind of person is pathological. For me, queer is more useful as a verb than as a noun. Nouns are often fixed and immutable, whereas verbs imply movement and action. It makes less sense to think about what queer is and more sense to think about what queer does. I think that this is also why I'm changing my thinking around what it is to be a teacher. That to be a teacher is to be an activist. It's to do work in the world. It's to constantly be moving. To constantly be acting. A word so fraught as queer. I'm going to give you a little bit of queer theory here. I'm not going to go too much deeper into this. Again, probably a whole nother keynote. A word so fraught as queer is fraught with so many social and personal histories of exclusion, violence, defiance, excitement, never can only denote, nor even can it only connote. And this is Sean and I. The story of identity in a learning space can't be told by one person or even 7 people, but only by a cacophony of voices, a gathering together of sounds, of ideas, of pedagogical intentions. In some ways, that's why talking about queering open pedagogy is not something I can get up here and do without all of you. The work is not me standing up here saying these words. The work comes later. In some ways, I would say that you all do the work. That's what's great about being a keynote. Like, you guys got to do all the work. But that's not actually it. It's that we do the work together, and we figure out how to come to these events together and bring our full selves, whatever that means for us at the moment, whatever feels safe for us at the moment. At the moment, there are events that people in this room don't feel comfortable going to at all. Bell hooks means something very specific when she talks about radical openness, and so far the open education movement has failed to tread that particular water. Sean and I have been using the word radical openness for a long time, even prior to our work being focused on open, being focused on digital pedagogy. Our work is grounded in critical pedagogy. Frere, Hooks, so this idea of radical openness is something that we brought with us to the open conversation. We brought not necessarily the concept of radical openness, that's Bell Hooks' concept to bring. We brought our thinking around that topic and the inspiration that we have felt, the driving force where that has pushed our work. In Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks writes, "For me, this place of radical openness is a margin, a profound edge. Locating oneself there is difficult yet necessary. It is not a safe place. One is always at risk. One needs a community of resistance." For Hooks, the risks we take are personal, professional, political. When she says radical openness is a margin, she suggests it is a place of uncertainty, a place of friction, a place of critical thinking. This is not an open pedagogy neatly defined and delimited. You can't actually get to the answer of what open is, of what being radically open is. Instead, it's a constant process of sitting on the margin. To me, that sounds like learning. That sounds like how I described learning a second ago. It means that we can't solve the problem of LGBTQ people in academia. We can't solve the problem of LGBTQ people at conferences. We can't solve the problem of making our events inclusive. It is something we have to do always, every second, every minute, with every breath, with every word we speak. Radical openness isn't a bureaucratic gesture. It has to be rooted in a willingness to sit with discomfort. It isn't a conference program. It isn't for as much as I think that they're extremely valuable, it isn't a code of conduct. It's something else. Sitting with discomfort. What if dialogue were the stuff of open pedagogy and not content? Radical openness means asking hard questions and having hard questions asked always of us. Teaching is always a risk, learning is always a risk. But that risk is not distributed evenly. A gay male administrator experiences the classroom differently from a black teacher, a disabled staff member, or a female student. We have to acknowledge that what I say on this stage isn't the answer. I'm one person. I am one person who's currently passing as cisgender, potentially passing as straight prior to this keynote. I am a white I am a white man. I have privilege to speak. We have to find ways to have conversations where the people who don't have privilege to speak have their voices heard. And we have to amplify voices by bringing them into our speech. When we're given a stage, we have to bring them in. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like for you. There's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of resources you can find on the internet for very practical things that you can do. Make other people's voices the center of your work. I'm going to actually skip a couple slides here because I'm going to end with another short video. I want to tell you a little bit about it. As I'm telling you about it, I'm going to put some Henry David Thoreau in front of this pride flag, which I really kind of love the juxtaposition of these two. Last time I did this Henry David Thoreau slide, I had a little bunny. It looked like Thoreau, the little bunny in the woods. Now it's Henry David Thoreau in front of a pride flag, and I think I mean for this to be complicated, because Henry David Thoreau also is writing from a very specific place of privilege. When he talks about civil disobedience, it means something very different than when Black Lives Matter talks about civil disobedience. The risk he put himself at is very different from the risk that people who aren't Henry David Thoreau put themselves at. So, the most profound pedagogical experience I've ever had didn't happen in a classroom. It happened with a group of students. I collaborated with them and created a It Gets Better video for Georgia Tech. This was in 2011. And a student came to me and they said, will you be the sponsor of the LGBTQ club? I had come from CU Boulder where LGBTQ students were visible. At Georgia Tech, they were just really not visible at all, and LGBTQ teachers weren't visible at all either. The person came to me because I happened to have a safe zone sticker on my door. Interestingly enough, I had been given that office that already had a safe zone sticker. I was kind of glad that it was there, but I didn't go through the safe zone training there. I just had this magical, vestigial safe zone sticker. They asked me, will you be the sponsor of the club? And then we talked about, okay, I said to them, I will, but it can't just be signing this paper for you because you need a sponsor. I will do it if you put me to work. They put me to work. I directed this video. It was the first documentary of this length that I made. But I made it with all of them. I had an assistant director. I had a producer who was a student. The lighting operator was a student. I had several students volunteering to edit this with me. We organized an event that brought together people on campus to have a conversation around this. For me, this was the best pedagogical act because it was entirely and utterly intrinsically motivated, and it was also me working for the students, and it was also me collaborating with the students, building something together. So I'm going to end with the words of some really, really marvelous students.
Here's what I have to say. If you are ever placed in the position of being told that who you are is so wrong and so broken that someone else wants to make you fix it, then you need to have the strength, if you can, to look that person in the face and tell them no. This is not acceptable. You cannot judge me so deeply that you literally, fundamentally want to change who I am.
It gets better each and every day.
It gets better because you find friends and you find creative outlets, you learn to dance and play the guitar.
You discover who you are and what you are, and you get to determine that for yourself.
I could go back to talk to my younger self. I think that I would have been so relieved during those years to know just not only does it get better, but exactly how much better it got.
If I'm just living my life as the woman I am, and it's not a big deal to me, then it's not a big deal to other people.
There are times when I have actually thought about being gay is a blessing in my life.
And it gets better because you find people who love you, and they love you for who you are.
One day, you're going to fall in love. And, maybe not that day, at that time, but eventually, someone else will love you back.
3 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought I would have someone. Just because. You know you're gonna be. I know. But I didn't even think I was gonna have anybody who would want to sit here through and like deal with the dysphoria and the issues that come up. But I'm her, and it gets better.
The negativity doesn't stop, but it does stop with you. You have to turn it around. You have to be an ambassador every day, and that sucks. But you have to buck it up for the rest of us, because we bucked it up for you. You have to be better.
I think having a positive attitude towards things helps a lot. Have a smile and get better.
There is no language for how I feel. There is no language for how I feel. When I look at you standing there, none of this seems real. There is no language for how I feel. 'Cause we're looking for a way to make it better. Looking for a way to change the weather. Whether you or I survive tonight, I promise you that I will love you like we'll live forever.
Thank you. So I'm going to sit with you all. Let's chat. We got about 7 or 8 more minutes, and I'm also happy to chat with anybody throughout the day. Hi. Thank you. Sean has a microphone. Bill.
Hi. You mentioned that you felt that this next phase of what you're doing was perhaps activism, not teaching, in terms of what education is. But I suppose, I think probably what you're doing and how I feel about it is that teaching can be activism. And I just would like to hear what you think that looks like when teaching is activism.
It's a complicated sentence, that sentence that I wrote. It was one of those, so I'll tell you all a little bit about my process when I'm writing. That piece actually appeared, that sentence actually appeared in another piece that I wrote about, I won't get lost in telling you about the other piece, but the gist is it appeared in another piece, and it was actually something that I tweeted. And a lot of my topic sentences end up being tweets, and in some ways I think aloud, and I think aloud with the people that I'm in conversation with. And then those tweets become parts of my presentations, parts of my published works. I think I'm still figuring out exactly what that sentence means. So, but my answer is that for me, of course it's still teaching. In fact, I would say all activism is also teaching. So in some ways it's a spiral. But I think to acknowledge, the key piece for me is to acknowledge that teaching is never not activism. And to talk in a pat way about teaching as anything other than sitting with the difficult lives of the students that we work with is to dishonor the work of teaching. Does that kind of answer your question? I can talk a little bit more about specifically how I think we do that. If I think at a meta level about what I did here, just bringing myself to the conversation by putting myself, making myself somewhat vulnerable, although again, not completely vulnerable at the beginning, is a kind of activism. And so when I'm talking about activism, I usually mean grassroots activism. I usually mean talking to people. I'm not an activist that waves signs. I actually don't think I've ever waved a sign in my life. I talk to people. And so for me, one of the things that happens for me when I tweet, for example, is when people engage with my tweets, I can't not be in conversation with them. So what I've found increasingly is like I'll tweet something and then, oh, there goes the rest of my day. Because I'm talking to all of these people on the, on the internet. A lot of people I know, people I don't know. And so for me, it's both of those things. It's a willingness to do action with our work of teaching, and also a willingness to be tireless. Yeah. Do you have other thoughts? Okay.
Thank you. Sort of to build on that, I'm wanting to think about how the act of learning as a student is activism. And I sort of wanted to see what you thought about that and how to, I guess, I'm trying to think of how to anchor that for myself.
I wish that every single one of you could be at the other digital pedagogy lab with us. Sign up, there's still a few spots left. There's not enough spots for all of you, but if you all want to be there, we'll try and make some room. Because Sarah Goldrick-Rath is going to be our keynote, and many of you have probably seen her speak. I think in some ways, and I hadn't thought about it to this moment, I'm actually getting kind of goosebumps thinking about it, like what happens when my work sits alongside Sarah's work? And I have been, from the second I met Sarah, I thought that her work was very different from my work. She does work on student advocacy from the perspective of access, and particularly around issues of food insecurity. And so not talking about access, can you get into college? Talking about, can you get a meal so that you can show up in the classroom? And I think that that work sits right alongside what I'm talking about, because I can't work with students if they can't make it to the class because they don't have any breakfast to eat that morning. I've seen a number of people doing this, and I'm now thinking about doing it, where they say to their students, if you can't get a meal today, actually I think Robin might have said this to her students. You've probably seen other people doing this, and the declaration is so amazing to me. The next time I teach, I'm going to do this. If you can't get a meal today, I will go buy you a meal. And the great thing is I'll go buy you a meal and probably sit down and chat with you while we're eating that meal together. But I guess not even making that part of the requirement. But I think that that's like a step towards what you're saying.
So the Academy notoriously leans left. And some of us unabashedly bring our belief systems and progressive agendas to the table like Sarah does, right? With no apologies whatsoever. Others of us are less willing to do so. And of course, the accusation from the conservative side of things is that the progressive left is shoving agendas down the throats of students. And I always find myself as an instructor thinking about power differentials, right? And so maybe I have the desire in my class to create a space for liberating theologies and conversations that empower students. But are we creating spaces that would also liberate a conservative student to advance his or her ideas and agendas and belief systems in a way that's safe? And so I think we need to work together to progress humanity, and yet there's such conflicting beliefs about what that looks like, and how do we create safe spaces for everyone, not just the people who align politically with what we believe. And I think that's a tough challenge for us because of those power differentials, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that we have to have 17 events like this one, more events. There's so much work to be done in order to even barely scratch the surface of that. But one thing that I want to say, and I'm going to say this like I hadn't really thought about this until you asked that question. I don't think that there's anything left about the argument that I just made. And I actually don't think that there's that, I mean, Sarah's left-leaning, I'm left-leaning. I don't think there's that much left about Sarah's work. Students being able to eat is not an agenda. I mean, it just isn't. And I think that's what's really hard, so sometimes there isn't a debate to be had about that. LGBTQ students being able to get to the classroom without being physically harmed on their way there is not left-leaning. And I know I'm not really preaching to you right now, but it did get me a little fired up. Because it's like, no, I'm not, yes, I'm left-leaning. There's nothing left-leaning about that. Time for, I think, one more question, and I'm happy to chat. There's a long break, so I'm happy to chat with people during the break. Oh.
I'm not going to call it out exactly, but there was one person on Twitter who talked about not feeling safe watching your keynote. They're not in the room. They were watching it live stream, and so they couldn't watch it. And I wonder about that as someone who works with Digital Pedagogy Lab and trying to make this the most welcoming and open space possible. Who are we not welcoming? Who are we not open to? And how do we change that?
Yeah. I think there's a shitload more work to do. That's the part where you have, the point that you think you've made it an inclusive event is the point that you just dead failed at making an inclusive event. That's my brief answer to that. I think, though, that to some degree, you and I, as we organize these events, because we have ideas about how to do this and how to build these events, I don't think we can do it on our own. We have to, and I don't think we do it on our own currently, but we have to continue to involve as many different kinds of people in the decision-making processes around an event like this. And I'm actually, just so you all know, I'm echoing back to Sean something he told me earlier today. We have to involve as many people as possible in the creation of these events, and I think that that's what needs to be done at any of these sorts of events.
Y'all hear that? We need your help.
Thank you. We have now a 15-minute break before you have to be at your tracks. I'm just going to hang out in here for a while, so if anyone wants to chat with me, I would love to talk to you. I'm also a hugger, so if anyone wants a hug, I feel like I need one. There's going to be a giant line for us. But honestly, to nod to Sherry at the beginning of the day, this is physical work too. And so recognizing that sometimes we need applause, sometimes we need a hug. Thank you.